Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a really foundational journey, looking at the systems that actually define how water moves across the land. We're not talking oceans here, but the landscape's architecture itself, the watershed.
That's right. And, for anyone trying to get properly informed about resource management or flood control, even conservation, yeah, the watershed is really where it all starts. The material we're drawing on today is pretty solid. It's basically foundational hydrology lecture stuff covering the structure, the classifications, and importantly, the measurement techniques that water engineers use everywhere.
Yeah, and our mission here is to give you a bit of a shortcut, right? We want you to get past just the basic definition and really grasp how it works in practice. So we're going to unpack those formal definitions, look at the surprisingly complex naming system for streams, and then really dig into the practical steps engineers take, the actual, art and science of mapping these really vital drainage areas.
Exactly. The goal is clarity, but also application. We need to get from this sort of abstract idea of water pooling somewhere to the measurable, structured reality of these stream networks. This deep dive should really equip you, the listener, with the understanding you need to look at, say, a topo map and pretty much immediately see how that landscape is directing water flow.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive in then, starting with the core concept, the definition that everything else really hangs on.
Right. So when we talk about a watershed, the core definition has to be functional, how it works.
Hmm.
According to the standard texts, a watershed is defined pretty strictly as an area of land draining to a stream at a given location.
Okay, that phrase, at a given location, that feels really important. It suggests the watershed isn't just like a fixed thing out there, but it's defined relative to where you're looking from.
Absolutely, that's key. The fuller definition expands on it. It's the area of land that feeds all the water. And this is important, both the water you see running on the surface and the water moving just underneath the surface. All of that gets channeled into a specific body of water or a specific stream outlet. It's the whole catchment area needed to keep water flowing at that single point you care about.
So it's not just the stream bed itself, it's the entire kind of three-dimensional bowl that captures and funnels the water, which immediately brings up this idea of scale and scope. If, like you said, every single point on a stream has its own watershed, these things must fit together like nesting dolls, right?
Completely. They're totally hierarchical, totally interconnected.
Yeah.
Think of tiny little stream catchments, first-order ones, feeding into slightly larger subbasins. And then those subbasins combine to form, a major river basin. Like a small creek might have a watershed of maybe 5 square kilometers. But that's nested inside the watershed of the regional river it flows into, which might be, say, 1,000 square kilometers. And that river might be part of the huge Mississippi drainage basin, for example.
Wow. Okay. So we can talk about watersheds at the really tiny scale, like a few acres or, continental scale. And you're saying in every single case, the boundary, the edge, is set by just one thing.
Correct. It boils down to physics and topography. Simple as that. Water flows downhill, always. So the highest points of land surrounding that drainage area, the ridges, the hilltops, they physically define the boundary. They're the dividing line, no matter what scale you're looking at.
And that boundary line itself, the high ground separating one catchment area from the one next door, that's got a formal name too, right? The watershed divide.
That's it. Often called the drainage divide or catchment boundary. It's just that continuous line separating land where water flows towards your specific stream from land where water flows away from it into a different system. And this line is, it's critical for everything. Environmental policy, city planning, you name it. Rain falls one side of that line. It ends up in stream A, falls on the other side. It's heading towards stream B. It's committed.
To really help visualize this, especially if this is a new concept for someone listening, the sources have this really great, simple analogy I think it's worth spending a sec on because it takes it from just being a line on a map to like a working system.
Ah, the inverted umbrella.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a classic. It's perfect for understanding the sort of closed nature of the system.
Yeah. So picture an open umbrella, right, but flip it upside down like you're trying to catch rain in it. That whole structure becomes a mini model of a watershed.
Exactly. The surface area of the umbrella fabric, that dome catching the raindrops, that's your watershed's land area. Every drop hitting inside is part of the system.
And crucially, all that collected water runs down to one single point, the tip of the handle maybe, which represents the stream outlet. That specific point we're interested in.
And the edge, that hard physical rim of the umbrella fabric.
That's the watershed divide. Rain inside the rim, it's in. Rain outside, it's going somewhere else. It works because it models that closed system perfectly, defined only by its highest edge.
And what's neat is you can sort of extend that analogy. Think about the shape. If you have a long, skinny umbrella versus a wide, round one,
Okay.
the water's going to take longer to get to the center in the skinny one, right?
Yeah.
That difference in shape, which is really just the shape of the divide determined by the land's topography, it has huge implications for flood timing. We'll get into that later with time of concentration.
That's a great point, connecting shape to timing. Okay, so to just round out the basic geometry here, let's quickly define two other key locations, confluence and mouth. Confluence is just where two streams meet, yeah.
Yep, simple as that. Any point where two streams or rivers or any water bodies merge. They usually form a larger, higher order stream downstream. These points are really key for measuring the combined flow.
And
The mouth is the end of the line. It's where the entire stream system, having gathered all the water from its whole network, finally discharges everything. Water, sediment, nutrients, the lot. Usually into a much bigger body of water like a lake or a reservoir or most often the ocean. Understanding what happens at the mouth is critical for things like coastal engineering, studying how deltas form, that kind of thing.
Okay, so we've got the boundaries, the divide, we've got the area, the watershed itself, and the key points, confluence and mouth. But, looking at a map with loads of streams, it looks like chaos. How do we actually bring order to that? How do engineers talk about one specific channel without getting confused?
Yeah, that's exactly why this next section is so necessary. I mean, the sheer number and complexity of stream channels across the globe, from tiny little trickles to massive rivers,
Well,
you absolutely need a standard way to name them, to classify them. This standardization is, well, it's non-negotiable, really. For hydrological modeling, for predicting how much sediment might move, for comparing research across different regions.
right, you can't just rely on local names like Mill Creek or Big River. We need a ranking system. Our sources mentioned how this system evolved, starting with Horton back in 45, but then moving pretty quickly to the standard most people use now from Arthur Strahler in 1964.
That's the one, the stream order system,
Yeah.
or often just the Strahler system. It gives us that quantitative hierarchy, that ranking. It lets us define the size and the position of a stream in the landscape based purely on its branching pattern.
Okay, let's break down the rules then, starting right at the sources, the very beginning.
Okay, so we start with first-order streams. These are the streams right at the top of the drainage system, the smallest channels. Crucially, they have no tributaries feeding into them.
They're the headwaters.
Exactly. All unbranching stream channels are, by definition, first order. They're the start of everything, usually way up in the hills or mountains.
The tiny headwater streams. Okay, so what makes it jump to the next level, second order?
A second-order stream is formed only when two or more first-order streams join together.
Okay. And then a third order stream is formed when two or more second order streams meet, and it just keeps going up like that.
That's the basic pattern, yeah.
It sounds pretty simple. The order only goes up when streams of the same rank join.
That simplicity is key for mapping, absolutely.
Hmm.
But it also leads us straight into the most critical and sometimes the most confusing part of the system, this thing called the non-changing rule.
Ah, okay. This sounds important. We should probably dig into this a bit more than just the definition. Why does this rule even exist, and what does it actually look like on the ground or on a map?
Right. The rule states this. Any single juncture of a lower order stream with a larger order stream does not change the order of the larger stream.
Okay, let's use an example. Say we have a big fourth order river. That means it's got a huge drainage area upstream already. If some tiny little first order stream trickles into it, the river below that point where they meet, it just stays fourth order. It doesn't become fifth order.
Exactly. It stays fourth order. And the technical reason for this is critical. The stream order system is designed to reflect the maximum cumulative drainage area upstream and the sort of established hydraulic capacity of the channel. That fourth order stream has already gathered water from potentially dozens or hundreds of thirds, second, and first order systems upstream. Adding one tiny first order stream contributes, well, a negligible amount of extra water and drainage area relative to what's already there.
Ah, okay. So the system prioritizes the dominant channel size that's already established. It keeps the classification stable.
Precisely. Stability is key.
Yeah.
The order only gets bumped up when two channels of equal maximum rank merge, signifying a major increase in contributing area. So if our fourth order stream meets a third order stream,
Still stays fourth order.
still fourth order below the junction. Because that third order stream, while significant, doesn't represent the same level of cumulative drainage as the existing fourth-order channel it's joining. It doesn't have enough weight, you could say, to upgrade the whole system downstream. This keeps the classification robust, which is vital for things like flood modeling or water allocation planning, where you need consistent metrics.
Makes sense. Now, you mentioned Horton versus Strawler earlier. Just quickly, why did Strawler's system kind of win out and become the standard?
Well, the original Horton system had this issue where it was really sensitive to the map scale you were using.
Oh,
Yeah, and also just how the person doing the mapping interpreted things. If you zoomed way in on a map, you might suddenly see dozens more tiny little streams you couldn't see before. Under Horton's rules, finding those could actually change the order of the major rivers downstream quite dramatically.
wow, that sounds messy.
It was. Strawler basically simplified the rules, especially that non-changing rule we just talked about. It made the resulting stream order much less dependent on the map detail. So it became for more stable, more reproducible, whether you were mapping in the field or using different maps. And, if you're trying to classify something huge like the Amazon, you need a system that gives you the same answer, whether you're looking at a continent-wide map or a detailed map of a local tributary. Strawler provided that consistency.
Okay, so with that stream order system clear, let's use it now to talk about where these streams sit in the landscape, starting right at the top. What are the key features of those headwater watersheds, the ones dominated by first and second order streams?
Right. These are, you could argue, the most critical areas, both ecologically and hydrologically. Headwaters are where it all begins. They're typically found in the steepest parts of the landscape, often high up in mountains or hilly regions. And crucially, they control the initial water quality and the amount of sediment that gets sent downstream for the entire system.
What does the environment actually look like up there, and what's the physics of the water flow?
Geologically, you're looking at steep slopes, high gradients. The streams flow fast, driven hard by gravity because it's so steep. They're actively eroding, cutting down into the land. They carve out those classic Z-shaped valleys you see in mountains. That V shape is a dead giveaway for rapid vertical erosion. The stream is literally digging down into the rock or the soil beneath it.
And that high speed, that high energy, must have huge consequences for moving material around.
Oh, absolutely. The physics here means high water speed translates directly into high shear stress. That's the force the water exerts on the stream bed and banks.
Hmm.
So when you get heavy rain in these steep headwater areas, the resulting stream flow has immense energy, enough to pick up and carry really large volumes of sediment downstream. They act like nature's conveyor belts for moving earth, sending sand, silt, gravel, sometimes even huge boulders tumbling down the system.
Okay, so if the headwaters are the high energy zones eroding and transporting stuff, what happens is those streams join up, become higher order, and we move downstream into what the outline calls the transitional and depositional zones.
Right, so as those first and second order streams meet, maybe forming third or fourth order systems, the overall slope of the land, the gradient starts to decrease. The landscape begins to flatten out. Our sources explain this as just a natural result of geology over time. The mountains erode, and all that material they scrape off has to get dropped somewhere downstream.
So the stream stops cutting down so much and starts moving more side to side.
Exactly. We transition from those steep V-shaped valleys into much broader valleys with gentler slopes. And the stream itself changes shape dramatically. Instead of flowing straight and fast, it starts to meander, to snake across the valley floor. The water's energy drops. It's not strong enough anymore to carry the biggest rocks and pebbles, so those start getting deposited along the banks and on the valley bottom.
This sounds like where floodplains start to form.
That's precisely it. The stream is now essentially building its own landscape. It's carving away at one bank on the outside curve of a meander and dropping sediment on the inside curve. Then the lower zone, the depositional zone, is the final stage. This is where the river gets close to sea level or maybe flows into a large lake, its ultimate destination, the mouth. Here, the water slows right down. The slope is almost flat. The river's ability to carry sediment pretty much disappears.
And this is where all that material, all that sediment that started its journey way up in those steep headwaters finally gets dumped, creating huge deltas, vast fertile floodplains.
Exactly. Think about the Nile Delta, or the Mississippi River Valley, or the Ganges Plain. These enormous landscapes are the end result of literally millions of years of erosion from countless tiny first-order streams, maybe hundreds or thousands of miles away. All that high-velocity flow and sediment transport, starting small, accumulating downstream. This deep connection is why understanding what happens in the headwaters is vital, even if you're managing flood risk way down on the coastal plains.
That's actually a really powerful thought. that the behavior of the smallest stream, way up high, dictates the long-term shape and history of the biggest landscapes way down low. Okay, so we've got the concept, the definition, and the structure with stream orders. Now, the really practical bit. How do you actually measure this boundary, this watershed divide, which you can't usually just see? That's where watershed delineation comes in. This is the process, right, that turns the geological theory into something engineers can actually use.
Delineation is absolutely fundamental. If you can't accurately draw that boundary, define the drainage area, well, you can't accurately predict how much water is going to run off it. Simple as that.
Yeah.
The process is defined as identifying the exact drainage area contributing to a specific point. And measuring that area is the critical first number you need for calculating flows, planning conservation, designing bridges, culverts, dams, everything.
So what's the absolute first step, the thing you have to do before you can even start drawing lines?
You absolutely must define the outlet. This is your point of interest. It's the specific location where you're designing something, maybe a bridge or a culvert, or where you're planning to put a monitoring gauge. It's that fixed point in space, and the watershed you delineate is the area contributing to that exact spot. If you move your outlet point just, say, 5 meters downstream.
The boundary might change slightly, and the total area feeding it could be different.
Exactly. Precision at the outlet is step one.
Okay, outlet defined. Now, the challenge for the engineer or the hydrologist is drawing that high ground bound, the divide, all the way around it. We have two main ways to do this, both relying on elevation data.
Yeah, historically and honestly still sometimes today for smaller projects or maybe quick field checks, the method uses topographic maps, paper maps. Our sources mentioned the traditional use of these, often at scales like 1.50,000, showing contour lines. It required, careful manual tracing and a lot of interpretation.
And the modern way, the one that's kind of transformed the field.
That uses high-resolution spatial data, DEMS, which stands for Digital Elevation Models. And you work with these using GIS, Geographic Information System software. So instead of you trying to eyeball contour lines on paper, the computer uses the raw elevation data, basically a grid, where each square has an elevation value, and it runs algorithms to figure out flow paths and draw the boundaries automatically.
It's a huge shift from manual to digital, obviously. But the basic principles of how you read the landscape, how you interpret the elevation data, they must still be the same underneath it all, whether it's on paper or screen.
Absolutely. The topographic map, in whatever form, is still the fundamental data source.
Right.
And yeah, a topo map is just packed with information, way more than just elevation. You've got streams, roads, buildings, forests, boundaries, all sorts of stuff that's useful for characterizing the watershed after you've drawn the line. But for actually drawing the line for delineation itself, it all comes down to reading those contour lines correctly.
Okay, let's refresh the basic rules then. Things people might have learned in school but maybe forgot. The rules you need to actually apply this.
Rule number one, the big one. Contour lines never cross each other. Can't happen. Each line represents one specific elevation. If they crossed, it would mean a single point on the ground at two different heights at the same time. Impossible.
Right. They might get really close together on a steep cliff, maybe even look like they touch, but they never actually cross.
Correct. Now, there is an exception noted in the sources, which is important for map reading.
Ah, yeah.
If you do see two lines crossing on a topo map, it means one is a contour line showing elevation, and the other line represents something else drawn on top, like a road or a power line, or maybe a specifically marked drainage channel or pipe. It's not two elevation lines crossing, it's just a feature overlay.
Good distinction. Okay, what's the next rule?
Second, they show equal elevation, and they're separated by constant contour interval. If the map says the interval is 20 meters, then the vertical difference between any one contour line and the next one up or down is always exactly 20 meters.
Okay, consistent spacing vertically. Now the key skill. How do those lines actually show you the shape of the land? How do you tell a ridge, high ground, from a valley, low ground, just by looking at the contours?
This comes down to looking at the V-shapes or U-shapes the contour lines make when they cross streams or ridges. For a depressed area, like a stream channel or a valley, the contour lines form a V-shape, and that V always points towards the highest elevation. Basically, the tip of the V points upstream, uphill.
Okay, the V points towards where the water is coming from.
Exactly. The water flows out of the open end of the V, heading downhill. Now, conversely, for a higher area, like a ridge or the crest of a hill, the contour lines also often form V or U shapes, but these point towards the lowest elevation. The tip of the V points downhill.
And that V, the one on the high ground pointing downhill, that marks the crest of the ridge, the place where water would split and flow down either side.
Precisely. And that is the absolute key, the aha moment for delineation. Because the boundary line we need to draw, the watershed divide, must always follow those highest points. It traces the crests, connecting the tips of those V's that point downhill.
So the whole process is basically finding and connecting those ridge crest V-tips, staying on the highest ground possible without ever dropping down into a stream channel.
You've got it. That's the fundamental act of delineation.
Okay, let's walk through the actual steps for doing it manually then, because even the GIS software is basically doing this just automatically. We start with step 1, locate the outlet, our chosen point.
Check. Point identified. Then we move to step 2, drawing the boundary, the divide itself, connecting the highest points around the basin back to the outlet.
And the sources really emphasize this specific geometric technique here, the perpendicular rule.
Yes, this is the core skill, the instruction for how to draw the line accurately. You start at the outlet point, right on the stream. Then you start drawing your boundary line away from the stream, moving uphill. And the rule is that boundary line must always be drawn so it crosses the contour lines at right angles or perpendicularly.
Okay. Why perpendicular? What's the logic there?
Well, think about how water flows. It flows downhill along the path of steepest descent, right? And mathematically, the path of steepest descent is always perpendicular to the contour line at any given point.
Okay.
So if water flows perpendicular downhill, the ridge line, the line of highest elevation where flow splits left or right, must also run perpendicular to the contour lines. By drawing our boundary perpendicular to the contours, we are essentially tracing that path of highest elevation, the path water won't naturally flow along.
Got it. We're tracing the line where water divides. So we follow this rule, keeping the line at 90 degrees to each contour we cross, always staying on the high ground, following those ridge V-tips. What can go wrong? What are the constraints?
The absolute key constraint is the boundary line you draw must never, ever cross a drainage path. Not the main stream, not a tributary, not even a tiny intermittent channel shown on the map. If your boundary line crosses a blue line, or whatever indicates drainage, you've just accidentally cut off part of the catchment area that should be contributing to your outlet. Your boundary is wrong. You have to back up and find where you dropped off the ridge.
Okay. So follow the perpendicular rule, stay high, don't cross streams. You trace this line up from the outlet, say along the left bank's ridge system, all the way around until you're above the very highest point of the stream network on that side.
Correct. You trace it all the way up and around the headwaters on one side. Then you go back to the outlet.
And repeat the whole process for the other side, the right bank.
Exactly. Start at the outlet again, draw perpendicularly away from the stream of the right bank's ridge system. Again, never crossing any drainage lines, always staying high. The process is finished only when the line you traced up the left side meets and perfectly joins the line you traced up the right side, usually somewhere above the absolute highest point of the headwaters. Now you got a closed loop defining the entire watershed boundary.
It sounds, frankly, painstaking, especially in flatter areas. I can imagine if the contour lines are really far apart, trying to accurately judge what's perpendicular, that must be tough and prone to error.
Oh, absolutely. That's the main challenge with manual delineation. In steep mountains, the contour lines are packed tightly together, so it's relatively easy to see the perpendicular direction. But in flat terrain like, coastal plains or prairies, where the ridge might only be a foot or two higher than the valley, the contour lines can be miles apart. Trying to apply the perpendicular rule accurately there without detailed field surveys is extremely difficult. Big source of error.
Which brings us neatly back to the GIS approach. How does the digital elevation model, the DEM, handle this problem automatically?
Right. So a DEM isn't lines, it's a grid. Think of it like a digital photo, but instead of color, each pixel has an exact elevation value. GIS software uses clever algorithms, the most common one is called D8, for deterministic 8 directions that look at the elevation of one pixel, or cell, and compare it to the elevation of the 8 cells immediately surrounding it. Based on those comparisons, it calculates the direction of steepest downhill slope for that specific cell and assigns its flow path towards one of those 8 neighbors.
So it's like calculating the steepest downhill path for millions of tiny squares simultaneously and then connecting all the paths.
That's a great way to put it. By figuring out the flow direction for every single cell on the grid, the software can then trace, computationally, which cells' flow paths eventually end up at the outlet point you defined. All the cells that contribute flow to your outlet get essentially colored in as the watershed. And the boundary between the contributing cells and the non-contributing cells is the watershed divide. It's all done by rigorously applying the physics of topography, basically automating that perpendicular rule check at a tiny scale, far more accurately and quickly than a human could do manually, especially over large areas.
Okay, so once that boundary is drawn, whether by hand or by computer, we finally have the watershed area, we can measure it. But just knowing the size, the number of square kilometers, that's only the first piece of the puzzle, right? To really understand how that watershed is going to behave hydrologically, we need to characterize its shape, its slopes, what the land cover is like, because all those things directly affect the water, yield how much water comes out, and the water quality.
Absolutely. And that characterization leads us straight into what might be the single most critical metric for anyone dealing with flood risk or designing hydraulic infrastructure.
Hmm.
The time of concentration, usually just called TOC. This is where the geography, the map, turns into a crucial timing factor for engineers.
Okay, time of concentration. If I'm designing, say, a culvert to go under a new road, why is knowing the TOC more important than just knowing the total watershed area upstream?
Well, knowing the area tells you how much rain might fall on the catchment, potentially. But the TOC tells you how fast the resulting runoff from that entire area will arrive down at your culvert. Floods, especially the dangerous peak flow, the highest rate of water flow, typically happen when intense rainfall continues long enough for the entire watershed to be contributing water to the outlet simultaneously. TOC tells you how long that takes.
Ah, okay. Let's get the formal definition then.
Okay, the primary definition is TOC is the time required for runoff from the most hydrologically remote point of the watershed to reach the outlet.
Most hydrologically remote, meaning the point from which it takes the longest time for water to travel.
Exactly. It's also often defined as the time at which all parts of the watershed are simultaneously contributing runoff to the outlet. Until the water from that farthest point arrives, the flow at the outlet is still increasing because more and more of the watershed is starting to contribute. Once water from that farthest point does arrive, the system has reached its maximum contributing area.
Right. Our sources also had that definition related to the farthest point, the time of flow from that point.
Yes, that's the more practical way it's often thought about for calculation. TOC is the time of flow from the hydraulically farthest point in the watershed down to the outlet. And finding that farthest point usually involves tracing the longest possible path that a drop of water could take, which typically starts somewhere way up near the watershed divide, often in the headwaters.
This really highlights that runoff isn't instantaneous across the whole area. The land right next to the outlet starts contributing almost immediately after rain starts. But the water falling way up on the ridges takes much, much longer to travel all the way down.
Precisely. And that time lag, the TOC, is absolute fundamental in hydrology. It's the primary time parameter used to develop a design hydrograph. That's the graph engineers use that plots how stream flow at the outlet changes over time during and after a storm. The TOC essentially determines how quickly the hydrograph rises the steepness of that rising limb, and, most importantly, it helps predict when the peak flow, the highest point on the graph, will occur.
Okay, so if a watershed has a short TOC, maybe it's small and steep and paved, the hydrograph shoots up really quickly, like a dangerous flash flood.
Exactly. Short TOC means a rapid rise, a flashy response. High peak happens quickly.
And if the TOC is long, maybe it's a huge watershed or very flat and forested, the hydrograph rises much more slowly. The flood is less peaky, more spread out.
Precisely. A longer TOC means a gentler rise, a lower, broader peak flow that arrives later. And this difference is why engineers obsess over calculating TOC accurately. They can't just guess it. They have to use standard, established methods to estimate it.
Can you give us a sense of what those methods look like? We've moved beyond just map geometry now, haven't we? This sounds like empirical calculations.
Yeah, it blends the map data with hydraulic formulas. There are several common methods, and the choice depends a lot on the watershed size and characteristics. For, say, small watersheds, especially in agricultural or urban settings, engineers often use relatively simple empirical formulas, things like the Kerpage method, or the SES lag method, or the TR55 method from the Soil Conservation Service. These typically rely on just the overall length of the longest flow path and the average slope of the watershed.
Okay, those sound like useful rules of thumb for smaller areas. What about for bigger, more complicated river basins?
For larger, more complex systems, or where more accuracy is needed, engineers might use more sophisticated approaches based on actual hydraulic routing principles, like methods derived from kinematic wave theory. These try to model the actual physics of how water flows as sheet flow across surfaces, then concentrates in channels. They require much more detailed information about the different parts of the watershed, all derived from that initial delineation and characterization.
Okay, so what are the key pieces of information from our map work that feed into any of these TOC calculations, simple or complex?
You generally need three main things that come directly from the map and watershed characterization. First, you need the length of the longest flow path from that hydraulically most remote point down to the outlet. You measure that directly off your map or GIS layer.
Okay, path length.
Second, you need the average slope along that specific flow path. You get that from the contour lines or the DEM elevation data along the path. Steeper slopes mean faster flow.
Makes sense. Length and slope, what's third?
Third is a measure of surface friction, how rough the ground is. It's called Manning's roughness coefficient, usually just called N. This isn't something you measure directly on the map. It's an empirical value, looked up in tables, that quantifies how much resistance different surfaces offer to flowing water.
Ah, so like a smooth paved parking lot would have a very low in value. Water flows fast.
Exactly. Very low N. Whereas a dense forest with lots of undergrowth and leaf litter would have a much higher N value, slowing the water down significantly. Cultivated fields, grassy meadows, concrete channels, they all have different standard and values.
So if our watershed is mostly steep, forested headwaters, it's got a high slope, which speeds water up, but also a high in value from the forest, which slows it down. The TOC calculation has to balance those.
Precisely. Compared to, say, an equally steep watershed that's been completely paved over for urban development, that urban one would have a much lower in value, so despite the same slope, water would race off it, resulting in a drastically shorter TOC.
And getting that TOC wrong. Say, the engineer calculates it based on forest, but then the area gets developed. Or they just use the wrong in value or miscalculate the slope.
If they calculate a TOC that's too long, maybe they overestimate the roughness or underestimate the slope, they'll predict that the peak flood flow will arrive later and be lower than it actually will be.
And if the real peak arrives sooner and higher than designed for,
Then your culvert, your bridge opening, your dam spillway, whatever it is,
yeah.
it's undersized. It gets overwhelmed. And that's how you get infrastructure failure, road washouts, unexpected flooding, potentially catastrophic damage, even loss of life.
Wow. So calculating that time of concentration correctly isn't just an academic exercise. It's literally about public safety and making sure our infrastructure can handle what the landscape throws at it.
Absolutely. It directly connects that abstract line you drew on the map, the watershed divide, to the very real-world capacity of a concrete structure or an earth dam. It's a critical link. #, outro.
We've covered a lot of ground today, really tracing this concept from, well, the simple clarity of the watershed idea, that area of land acting like an upside-down umbrella feeding one point, all the way to the complex engineering reality of predicting how quickly water actually gets there.
Yeah, we layered that structure on using the stream order system to classify the network, from those tiny first-order streams up in the hills right down to major rivers. And understanding that crucial non-changing rule, how it ensures the classification reflects the real drainage power.
And then we moved into the practical skills, getting a handle on delineation, how engineers read the maps, using those contour V-shapes and that vital perpendicular rule to trace the high ground and define exactly what area drains to their point of interest, whether they do it by hand or with GIS.
Right. And finally, we saw how all that geographical work culminates in calculating the time of concentration, that critical timing metric that lets us turn the abstract shape of the land into real, actionable numbers for designing infrastructure that can actually handle the peak flows the watershed will inevitably deliver.
I think the big takeaway for me is just how interconnected it all is. From the smallest scale to the largest, every little bit of land, every tiny stream, it's all part of this measurable system, this drainage machine.
Yeah, and the complexity of the system is really only matched by the rigor needed to understand and manage it properly.
And connecting back to that bigger picture you painted earlier, thinking about those headwater streams way up high in their steep V-shaped valleys.
Yeah, remember they kick off the whole process, not just the water flow, but they generate the sediment too. Their high energy starts moving material that gets carried down through the transitional zones and eventually gets composited way downstream to build those huge floodplains and deltas we see at the mouths of rivers. That initial steepness way upstream is like the geological engine driving the whole long-term landscape evolution.
It really highlights the scale, doesn't it? That deep connectivity. So for you, the listener, maybe the provocative thought to leave you with, builds on that idea of timing, the time of concentration. Next time you get some really heavy rain, try to picture the most remote spot in your local watershed. The farthest ridgeline may be miles away, the river or creek near you, the culverts under your roads. They're designed, hopefully, to handle the peak flow that occurs only when the rainwater falling on that exact remote spot finally makes its journey all the way down to the outlet near you.
Yeah.
Knowing roughly how far away that point might be, how long do you think it takes? How many hours, maybe even days, in a really big basin does it take for your entire landscape to become fully switched on with every part contributing water? Every ridge, every slope, every field, every street. They're all calibrated components in that giant timing machine.
It's a great way to think about it. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the fundamentals of watersheds and hydrology. We hope you look at the landscape and the rain a little differently now.
Until next time on The Deep Dive.